The Salem Center Objectivism program is not yet ready for primetime podcast. We are experimenting with both technologically how to do this and formats, and not yet telling too many people that we're up doing this. But the idea is to get together about once a week and to talk about issues in philosophy and in the culture, and to do it in a room with some people so we could have discussion and take advantage of the being able to be in person again.
Does this make me Paul Schaefer or you Paul Schaefer?
Well, neither of us has a kind of nest of keyboards. You are correct, sorry. That would make me
That's
a
a different.
man, I
That's
guess.
a different show.
Yeah. So we thought we'd talk today about individualism versus collectivism, and how do we put it on the card? The kind of
Individualism versus collectivism, human nature, ethics, and politics.
so this came up. Why are we doing this topic? Should I be asking you or you me that? I'm not sure.
Well, as I recall last week when we were discussing the is politics downstream from culture topic, a lot of what we talked about was the sort of tribalist strain of the current alt-right. What the new right has become, their view is that it's the culture that's so important to fight about. And in conversation with some people in the audience, it came out there was a lot of sympathy for the idea that, well, the culture is really important, especially if you think that you need to be in a battle for the culture, where the battle for something greater than yourself is seen as a kind of noble ideal. Mm-hmm. And so I think this led to the discussion of, well, is being part of something greater than yourself actually a noble ideal? That's what the collectivists maintain. We raised some questions about whether that was really true, and whether you could find meaning in your life through goals and ends more individualistically conceived.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, you can think that a lot of the issues in our culture are individualism versus collectivism, come down to that, whether we view ourselves as autonomous individuals interacting in a group, or whether we view ourselves as fragments or parts of the group. Rand, in her time, thought of that as a kind of fundamental issue of her time, and was kind of saw many of the political conflicts as turning on that. Certainly the kind of society conflicts of the communist world versus the free world as kind of embodying those different values when she's writing in the 60s and 50s, but even before that in the 40s and 30s, these two competing strands in the world, and
not just capitalism versus communism, but versus fascism as well. She thought
Yes.
that fascism and communism were both variants of the same collectivist evil.
Yeah, so there's an idea that fascism was in bad odor sort of with everybody after World War II, and communism less so, although, there was a lot of anti-communism as well. But the kind of basic ideal behind it wasn't dead, which was this collectivism, and there was still too much sympathy for communism. But she didn't sort of take at least the kind of fascism that was popular in Europe in the 30s as so much of an enemy in the 60s and 70s, although she thought, again, that there was a kind of way in which what the American left then was tending towards was fascism, a version of it. But there is this, if you go back to her stuff in the writing in the 40s, and fascism was another big concern, and she saw it as very much the same kind of thing. But we're going a little too much into biography. So there's this idea that the defense of freedom, the defense of what's good about America, of what's good about Western culture, because this is something that came up last time too, the issue of, like, what are we fighting for if there's something in our culture that we're fighting to preserve? There's these values of reason and individualism. And they're values that, maybe are present somewhat to some extent wherever people are doing well. Insofar as Western culture is good or has something good about it, it's that it had times and movements and strands that really emphasized reason and individualism more than in other cultures. And it's in the periods when those were in the ascendancy that the things that are really valuable and great were formed, and those are the things that if we want to save something about our culture, we should save. Um, but there's always been this undercurrent, this competing force of collectivism, tribalism, anti-individualism that's connected to irrationality or irrationalism, emotionalism, and this is the conflict. And we got some pushback about the idea of, is that really true? Can you really have meaning in life apart from the struggle of one group from another? So there was some kind of, I was thinking last week was sounding like Italian fascism in the particular variations that we're hearing. But you hear it in the culture a lot. It seems like now the political struggle in America isn't between individualism and collectivism, but different varieties of what collective matters, whether it's your race or your class or the collective of humanity as a whole, or your nation, or what, versus and there's a need to kind of reassert individualism and talk about what it is. So I thought we'd spend a little time talking about what individualism is. Before we go into that, though, I just want to, on the technical side, how's our audio sounding? Do we know? And also, what does our shot look like? It looks like our heads are cut off a little bit in the shot to me, but I'm not sure.
We're a little tight. Could stand to pull it back just a bit.
This is the not ready for prime time aspect of this, where we're doing technical difficulties.
Won't know for a little while.
Okay, yeah. Well, but he'll know.
I was just going to mention one thing about fascism, that in American political discourse these days, there's not a lot of appreciation for what that term really even means, or where the term comes from. It's kind of equated with just kind of generic dictatorial tyranny, but it's a specific ideological framework. And it comes from the word fasces, which is the bundle of sticks with the axe on it, which you see all over, I guess, Roman decorative arts, and you even see it in a lot of founding American, like it's on the dollar bill, and it's symbolic of the 13 states being bound up together into a single bundle, where they're stronger together than they are separately, and so it's used when the fascists talk about it. They're using it to connote the idea of individuals are weak and separate when they're all alone, stronger when they're together, when they're forming a collective whole, struggling for some greater end.
Yeah, so what is the doctrine, though, if we're going to talk about it? Like, what is the ideology? So there's this Italian fascist ideology. There's Nazism, which is also called fascist, and they're not exactly the same as the Mussolini kind of ideology, but of course they were allied. Did you say anything about what it is?
Well, I know less about what distinguishes fascism from other forms of collectivism than I do about collectivism generally. But, I mean, you should probably supplement, but as I understand it, fascism is the more nationalistic version of collectivism, whereas socialism is more international in its scope. So fascism is more oriented toward the cultures, sometimes the race, though not always, of a particular nationhood, versus collectivism, versus socialism, which is all uniting the workers of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways people draw these distinctions, and I'm not conversant enough with all the views with all the particular views that get grouped together as fascist, and with all the ways people have tried to classify them to know to be entirely confident. The way Rand distinguished fascism from communism, and I think here she was following von Mises, was on the issue of whether there's collective ownership of property or just collective control of it. So that's one axis. If you look at fascist Italy, Franco's Spain, and Nazi Germany, for that matter, there wasn't the government nationalizing all the property and all the industry. They were still maintained in private hands, but there was sort of totalitarian control over the industries by the government. So she thought of that as nominally private property, but collective control. So that's one axis. What do you do with property? But the other axis where there's a differentiation was nationalist versus internationalist. So communism, at least the Marxian version, but the versions that were most popular, was meant to be a global movement uniting the working class and ultimately leading to a future classless society. And it was supposed to break down differences between nations, and supposed to be something to do with humanity as a whole, or at least a certain class of humanity as a whole that would then fulfill a project of humanity as a whole. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Italian fascist writers, what they're very concerned to differentiate them from is that kind of internationalist or globalist vision. And they're thinking humanity as a whole doesn't have the kind of unity or structure or organization to function as an agent in history, to achieve goals, to provide meaning to life. Neither, though, does an individual have that. And so they were keen to distinguish themselves from the liberal or individualistic ideal of autonomous individuals, but also from the idea that we should see ourselves as part of the human race as a collective whole. Rather, we should see ourselves as part of nations or parts of races or parts of volks or peoples, but something that is transcends the individual, transcends time. So it's not just all the people alive now, but the Italian race was in the past and will be in the future, and we're part of this grand project, and likewise whatever people you're part of. You need that to find meaning for yourself. Again, according to these fascists, but you can't find your meaning in the same way in humanity as a whole.
The way you just framed the difference between those two versions of collectivism, the fascist and the socialist, points to the fact, I think, that what both of these doctrines depend upon is a certain view of human nature, a certain metaphysical outlook. Because you talked about whether or not the nation or the globe has the status that it needs to have agency in history. And they claimed that, the fascists say that the global population doesn't, but neither does the individual. And of course, if you're an individualist, you're someone who does think that the individual has all the agency that matters here. Mm-hmm. And so you might think of collectivism versus individualism as a ethical, political controversy or question, but at base, it's really kind of a metaphysical question. It's about who has agency, what has agency, and that connects to all kinds of questions about free will versus determinism, the efficacy of the individual mind. So, can you have knowledge, or is some kind of skepticism true? All these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and some of those were coming up last time. Mom was raising them. Who's with us in the audience now? When I first wrote on this issue, was back in, I don't remember the year, but there was a book called Essays on Ayn Rand's Anthem, and I wrote about individualism versus collectivism in Rand's writing there. And I wanted to kind of anchor it to, I'm not just coming out of one particular philosophy or even what I learned in philosophy graduate school, and saying, like, how is this term used generally? And so in a piece I did on that, thinking about what is individualism, I just looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. And they had 3 definitions of it, because they'll give you definitions in different senses, that I found really useful. I found the interconnection between them really useful, so I'm just going to read them. 1, self-centered feeling or conduct as a principle, a mode of life in which the individual pursues his own ends or follows out his own ideas, free and independent individual action or thought, egoism. So that's a kind of ethical meaning. Egoism as an ethical doctrine is one meaning of individualism. 2, the social theory which advocates the free and independent action of the individual as opposed to communistic methods of organization and state interference, opposed to communism and socialism.
That's the more political
So that's the political
version.
meaning. There's individualism, so egoism versus altruism you could think of as the ethical dimension. Communism and socialism as opposed to a social theory which is organized around the individual, think of it as capitalism or individualism in the political sense. And then definition 3, in metaphysics, the doctrine that the individual is a self-determined whole, and that any larger whole is merely an aggregate of individuals, which if they act upon each other at all, do so only externally. I think that's a really good way of stating what the kind of metaphysical issue is. The individual is a self-determined whole, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to something like the cells in a body or the organs of a body, which kind of what they are fundamentally is part of a larger whole and can only be understood as such. And everything about them and what they are is determined by their place in this whole. Rather, if something's an individual, it acts on others, or it may act on others anyway. It acts on us, if at all, only externally. It has some kind of internal thing that it is, and then it acts on others, subsequent to that or coming from that.
And this is a good example then, I mean, insofar as these political, ethical questions depend upon a certain view of metaphysics, it's a good example of a theme we've been stressing the last few episodes, I think, about how, at least from Ayn Rand's perspective, you need to be thinking about the fundamentals, the philosophic fundamentals, if you want to defend a certain kind of social system. Part of what she's stressing when she says you have to choose your issues is, well, choose the ones that, where you can bring the most light to these fundamental questions that are, end up determining the answers to various political questions.
Yeah, and of course, it's not that you start off, at least I hope, wanting to defend a certain political system, come hell or high water, whatever the issues turn out to be. You start out, thinking one's right and the other's wrong, and if you get into the questions of why one is right and the other's wrong, and are you right about them, and rethinking them, and what exactly is the difference between, if you think America's system is better than the Soviet system, as I think we all do, what exactly is that difference? What does it amount to? What would it be to be like America is, but more so, or purely, given that we don't think any country fully lives up to what it could be? It'll bring you into these deeper questions if you're doing it right. Questions about, well, what is a human being? How should we be interacting with one another? How should a society be organized to enable us to interact with one another in that way, whichever way it is that's good? And then what kind of things are we, such that we're capable or not of those kinds of interactions? But I want to think about this metaphysical individualism, the idea that we're a self-determined whole, and we act on each other only externally. What does that mean? And how would you determine whether it's true? I mean, I have lots of parts. I have organs that make me up and cells that make up my organs and so forth. And in some sense, I'm composed of these things, right? And also at the same time, I'm parts of things that are in some sense greater than myself. I'm one person who works at this Salem Center, or the Salem Center is part of the University of Texas. Texas is a state in America, and I'm a resident of that state and a citizen of the United States of America, and I'm a consult with the Ayn Rand Institute sometimes. There's lots of things I'm a part of. I'm a member of a family and a member of a nation.
It's a problem of mereology.
It's a problem of mereology. Yeah, like I'm part of a lot of wholes. A lot of things are part of me. What does it mean to say that primarily I'm an individual? What's special about this level that, like, I'm me and I'm made of stuff and I'm part of other things, but the other things that I'm part of, I'm not parts of, like my parts are part of me. What's the difference? What's privileged about this level of the individual?
Well, let me start off with a novice take on this kind of question. What if I said, well, look, here I am. I see my body. It's separate from your body. It's separate from all the bodies of the people in the audience. Every once in a while, I will be in contact with other people, but for the most part, we go about our separate ways. I have conversations with you. You hear things that I say. I hear things that you say. I think about the things that you say, but I seem to have a mind of my own. So is it just that we're physically individuated from each other, or is there more to it than that?
Well, the line of reasoning you went through included a lot more than physical individuation.
That's true.
Because you talked about thinking and what I say and what you do with response to what I say. But I mean, you could think about, like, what about the bees in a hive or the ants in a colony? They're physically individuated from one another. Are they individuals? I mean, in some sense, I think yes. But there's a sense in which I think the question of what is the unit here, what thing is free and autonomous and it acts on the others only externally, I think is a lot more ambiguous in the case of the ants than it is for us. Like, the ant's organs are the ant is more nearly to the ant colony as the individual ant's organs are to it than I think the relation of me to society is to the parts to me.
Just saying a little worker drone ant is a bit more like an organ in a body, and maybe it's like the arm of the body, and the queen bee is more like the head, and so that makes it closer to sort of like an organism of its own.
I don't think they're exactly the same. I think there still is a difference in the case of the bees, but everyone thinks there's some difference, right? And
Yeah.
I think if we were like bees, this would be a much more, or ants, a much more ambiguous question. What I think makes it so distinctive in human beings is that human beings think, and thinking is an issue of free will. And I think for the other animals, their lives are directed by kind of inherited patterns of behavior. Maybe there's a little bit of sociality in there where like things are mimetically passed down, as they say, from generation to generation. Bird songs or whatever are passed down not just through the genetics, but through some learning. But it's very slight changes, and each animal is basically pre-programmed to live the way it's going to live, and whatever its relationship to other members of its species, some of them live in more lonely ways, and some of them live in more communal ways. And it's different, across the animal kingdom for different animals. But what's common for all of them is they're just, going through a program. And what I think is distinctive to human beings is that there isn't a common program we all go through. There are common needs we all have, but there's no one way that we automatically live. And there's no way in which all the people in a culture just automatically live, having imbibed it from the cultural zeitgeist, and they just all, Frenchmen just behave like this, or people in China or Azerbaijan just go acting the way a Frenchman or an Azerbaijani acts. And that's not how human beings work. There's a lot of influences we get from other people. We even learn language in which we think from other people. But the act of thinking, and this is something I think one has to introspect for oneself and see to be true, but I think we all do know it to be true, that the act of thinking is something we each do on our own, can do or fail to do, have a kind of control over, and that act is central to our lives, central to our motivation, central to what we are, central to our ability to direct ourselves, to our ability to, it's to what we're doing when we internalize any kind of norm. We think of it as like, I should do this. I, who can do otherwise, should act this way. All of that, I think, presupposes the kind of choice that an individual has. And that choice shapes their life. And it's that fact that I think makes the level of the individual human being special. There's a kind of causal difference in how we function from how other things function.
Look here, it's to play devil's advocate on this kind of issue. If you are mooring your individualism to something as metaphysically substantive as the doctrine of free will, I mean that's a big commitment that you're now depending upon, and a very controversial one. Like we could talk about what you mean by free will. There's more and less controversial versions of that concept, but it's even the less controversial ones are still fairly controversial in intellectual circles. There's definitely a bias in favor of various forms of determinism, whether nature or nurture, genetic or environmental versions of determinism. And you might argue this is, when you look at the different kinds of collectivism that are now popular, you can understand each one as rooted in some version of determinism. So the kind of more nationalistic versions are rooted in a kind of genetic version of determinism. The more socialistic versions are rooted in a more environmental, economic form of determinism, sometimes explicitly so in the case of Marxism.
Well, so it sounded like you were playing devil's advocate, and then it sounded like you rallied to the side of the angels in your advocacy. Because it is the question, should we be hitching our advocacy of this controversial political doctrine, individualism, to this super controversial metaphysical doctrine, free will? Well, if that's what the issue really turns on, then yes. And I don't think you come into a political issue if you're being honest about it, right? Like, I've got a certain politics and I'm going to defend them come hell or high water, and I'm going to adopt whatever other things I need to defend them. You think about, like, what is it that seems to me to be right about this politics, and am I right about it? And what is it that seems to me to be driving the opposing view, and is it wrong? And individualism is a beleaguered position. It's a position that does not have much explicit intellectual support for it. It's a minority intellectual position. It's a minority political position. It has been for sort of all of our lives and for most of this century. There's a kind of strain that's supporting it in American culture and European culture and in some other cultures, but I know those two best. But there's so much going against it, and that's exactly the profile that you would expect for it if it's the political manifestation of taking free will seriously. Because free will itself is something that it's super controversial. You don't find many explicit, consistent defenses of it among intellectuals, but you find a real strain of belief in it and concern about, well, maybe we don't really have it, and then wouldn't that be bad or wrong? Or, there's a kind of anxiety about it that you find in the culture that's very much like the anxiety you find about individualism, a certain kind of attachment to it or wanting it, but a certain kind of thinking, well, it's not right or not intellectually respectable or something. I think it has the same kind of profile, and the reason why it has the same profile is it's the same issue. And then I think this is why I said you were coming in your devil's advocacy to the position. The other thing is, like, if you look at the flavors of collectivism that there are, they tend to map to flavors of determinism. Are you determined by your economic class? Are you determined by your genes? Are you determined by your society that you were brought up in? And if so, on what scale does that social determining work? On the scale of a nation, on the scale of the human race, on the scale of your family, on the scale of, whatever, some cultural ethnicity you're a member of.
That's only coming to the side of the angels if you are already taking for granted that all those versions of collectivism are bad.
Yeah.
And I still think
Thinking
trying to be
maybe
a
they're
devil,
not.
because there are a lot of people who side more with one of those versions of collectivism or another because they think those determinisms make sense, and not just fascism and socialism, but there's any number of identity politic views these days are usually motivated by some kind of you can't get out of the purview of your own ethnic group's worldview. That's a kind of determinism, and those are tribalistic views as well.
I mean, that's a kind
popular.
of determinism is something we should come back to, because it's a kind of deep point. But I think part of what you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about defending a position is sort of, what are you in this for? Are you an advocate of something just to be an advocate of it and you're signed up for that? Or is there something you're convinced is right? You have reasons for thinking it, and you're trying to articulate what those reasons are and just what the thing is that you think is right. Because as you articulate your reasons for a position, the kind of content of the position becomes clearer too. These things go together. And I don't know if I ever started as an advocate for a political position. I started as an advocate for a kind of moral position. Certain things seemed right to me and wrong to me, and my politics, insofar as I had a politics early on, was connected to that. And as I articulate what appeals to me about political freedom, for example, what seems right to me about the Enlightenment as a historical tradition and period, what seems right to me about the founding of America, especially when I think about how do I disentangle it from the things that were wrong about the society at that time. It is the sense that it respects the thing about me, which is me. The ability of myself to make decisions, to form values, to be, to think for myself and live for myself. And that, I think, ultimately comes down to my having free will. So I think, a lot of these issues are just, they're free will when you articulate them all the way.
It strikes me that the way you're even describing what's the proper procedure for inquiry into these kinds of questions is already shot through with a individualistic pro-free will perspective, because you're pushing back against the idea people start off with a politics they're trying to rationalize, and they'll just do whatever they can. Reason's the slave of the passion is predetermined. You're saying, no, you can start off by asking yourself the simple question, is this doctrine about free will actually true? Is, what follows from it, politically speaking, and then what does that tell us about what's actually true in politics? It sounds like you're saying that the free will, it isn't just a doctrine about do you control whether you raise your arm or not, which is the kind of standard stock example they'll often give in philosophy classes, but it's deeper than that. It has to do with, can you guide your own process of inquiry? Can you choose how to use your mind to decide what's true or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's Rand's view of free will as being, consciousness and reason being volitional. But you say like I'm presupposing that in my approach to advocacy of this issue, or the recommendations I'm giving of how to proceed. And yeah, I am presupposing that.
It wasn't meant as a criticism necessarily.
Yeah, I mean,
so someone could make it as one.
But I think what I'm calling attention to, or trying to call attention to, is something that I think is presupposed in all honest thinking. That is the idea that you're in control of your thinking, you're trying to direct it, you're trying to get at what's true, or you're faking something, right? And you know the difference between those. And I think that is something that's kind of essential to thinking, is part of thinking, is something that you can't deny consistently, and that you can notice as part of, built into and basic to thinking, if you reflect on it. And so, yeah, it is true that it's kind of the conclusion I'm trying to get to. But what it is to reduce something down to fundamentals is to identify the kind of principles that don't require further justification, that one can in effect tell are true at a ground level. And I think this is one of them. And I think you can kind of see it as presupposed in thinking as such if you kind of reflect on your motivations for thinking and on what you're doing when you're trying to think.
Okay, but so on the one hand, this gets us a little deeper into understanding where this individualist position comes from, not just some kind of conception of free will, but a very particular conception of free will. But as I mentioned before, this is a very controversial view. And I suspect one of the kinds of objections that people in our audience are going to make at this point is that it sounds like you're really investing the individual inquirer with quite a lot of sovereignty. And I think people will wonder, do we really have that? So, like, is your view that we, in effect, can discover the whole realm of human knowledge all for ourselves, and we have to, like Descartes, go back and start from nothing and build it up all ourselves if we're to count as truly autonomous inquirers? Don't we all have to learn from other people? Don't we all have to take the material that we're given by our society and run with it? Are we really as autonomous as you're letting on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Descartes reference is interesting because I think we are as autonomous as Descartes thought we were. And I think there's something, I mean, objectivists tend to hate on Descartes, and there's a lot wrong with him, I think. But there's also something right with him, which is that there's a real emphasis on taking responsibility for your thinking in Descartes that's also in Locke and in Bacon. There are a number of people around this time who are, I think, really focused on certain ideas that are inherent in honest thinking, that, you have to be rigorous, you have to be methodical, you have to try to get it right. And those things really shouldn't be thrown out. And I think coming with that is the idea of tracing knowledge back to its foundations, which is something that's also in Descartes and I think is good in him, as well as in those other thinkers we mentioned. The problem with Descartes in particular, I think he had a really wrong view about how to do it. And there are a couple of elements to that wrongness view. One of it is a more technical thing, the idea that you can know about your own consciousness before you can know about the world, and you have to argue your way out of from inside your head. So that's one, I think, disaster in Descartes. But the other is this idea that the kind of way to get there is to kind of tear everything down and build up from scratch. There's a way in which that's true and a way in which it's not true. You don't have to kind of go lock yourself in a room with a furnace and try to pretend that everything you think you don't know, and you couldn't possibly know anything, and so forth, and then try to build back literally in chronological order from scratch. But there is a process that one, I think, has to go through to know something, of tracing it back. How do I know this? Where did it come from? That you can only do yourself. And if you think of it as you have a structure that you inherited from other people, you maybe learned it from other people, and you've been kind of taking it on your kind of generalized trust of them for a while, you have to like check how sturdy is this structure. And maybe you can't do it all at once. You have to kind of go back bit by bit. And a lot of it is done by acquiring and forming habits of checking things as you go, rather than a dramatic moment where you sit in a room and try to build everything, raise the structure and build everything else up. But I think of it like, somebody who has a bridge that they're repairing, and there's the crew that kind of goes up, and checks each part out. And once they're done, they go back and check again. And they're always working on the bridge and ensuring that the structure is sound. And I think that's something that we all have to be doing with our knowledge. And you got to do it yourself, for your own knowledge.
But take the
No less than Descartes thought you did.
take the position that your young son is in. Children come into the world knowing nothing, being unable to fend for themselves materially. They require your sustenance, and they require education that they get from you and from the people that you pay to teach them. And I mean,
My son
Aren't
is
they
turning
given-
3, by the way, just for context for you.
he's what?
Just how old he is.
Oh, he
is
just turned
relative for
3,
context.
right,
He's
yeah.
about to turn 3, yeah.
So isn't there a lot that they have to rely on from other people and from their society? And doesn't it, I mean, this is where the "it takes a village to raise a child" idea comes from, and that is definitely a collectivist as opposed to an individualist idea.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you're 3, you need to rely on other people to feed you. The question of what the relevance of that is what relevance does that have to how you live when you're 23? And we'll talk about that later, but you're not 3 when you're 23. You're able then to feed yourself.
Most of us.
And with respect to the knowledge, you're learning things from other people. Some of what you're learning from other people when you're little, you're taking kind of on, in effect, their authority and not really understanding it. I think even when you're 3, there's a difference between the things you understand for yourself and the things that you just take someone's word for. I could see it in my son. Not that he's wrong to be taking my words for things, but you can see this kind of light that goes on when he recognizes something for himself. And you could also see him pushing back at me when I tell him things like, that's a chandelier. No, that's not a chandelier. Yes, it is a chandelier. And like, because he's got a sense of like what makes chandeliers go together. I have to have arguments with him. No, that only has one light bulb in it. Would have to have multiple light bulbs. And you could see him thinking to see if that makes sense. And this happens all the time. It's like a surprising how early it happens, that there's like pushing back and sometimes it's just being contrary, but there's a surprising amount of like pushing back that's trying to understand something, and an excitement when you understand things. That's kind of that original connection. And the whole edifice of human knowledge is built of people having done that, starting when they were 3 and going up to when they were 93. And so it's not the case that as a little kid, you just absorb what other people tell you and hold it as stuff I got from them and it's true. You do absorb a lot of stuff, and you need to. And some of it is just, this person told me this is called this or whatever. But there's a lot of independent thinking that's happening in order to be able to learn, even when you're 3. What there isn't is self-consciousness about that. Knowing what you got in what way. The stuff that you absorbed, the stuff that you thought through yourself, the stuff that's just something you remembered, all kind of gets stored in there. And it's, kind of later in life, when you're preparing to be able to live on your own, when you're preparing to be able to take charge of your life, when you're maturing, that you have to go and think through a lot of that stuff and think, well, what do I just believe? Because that's what I've always been told, and that's what I'm used to hearing, and I don't really understand what it means, and what do I understand? And that's part of what makes the person, if he does it at 23, able to fend for himself in a way that the 3-year-old isn't. And it's the extent to which a person that does that's a big part of the extent to which they can live for themselves.
Okay, so let's suppose just provisionally that you've addressed some of the tougher metaphysical and epistemological questions about individualism here. We should talk about some of the kind of axiological questions, the questions of value and meaning.
By the way, is anyone
Someone says our
anyone
sound is
watching us?
better.
Are people saying things?
They are saying our sound is better this week, so yes.
That's good.
Thank you,
Are
Ian
they,
and Shrugs.
who is this? Ian and
Ian's been with us for the last few weeks, so
Hi, Ian.
he's noticed.
So does Ian have any comments or thoughts other than about sound quality, like about the quality of what we're saying? Or,
He now knows he's welcome to tell us.
Okay.
But I wanted to go back to the question of meaning and value because, okay, suppose I can make of my life what I choose, if I so choose. I suppose I have that sovereignty and autonomy. Is there anything fulfilling about that? That some of the arguments we got last week were, if you're living an individualistic existence, it's a kind of bourgeois, mundane, humdrum life that pales in comparison to the depths of meaning that you can get by struggling for something that is greater than yourself, when you're seeing yourself as part of something greater than yourself, and plug in whichever higher cause you want to there. And when I heard that comment, I don't know if you know, I took particular offense at it because I'm married but no kids, not planning on having any, working for a hyper individualistic cause since I work for the Ayn Rand Institute. I should be about as petty bourgeois as they come by all these standards. So why isn't my life meaningless, Greg?
I mean, all this bourgeois language is sort of a smear the way it's used, I think. So, but
Yes.
so there are two comments in that point. I mean, one is to what extent is struggle important to meaning in life, and this is something that is, at least potentially separable from the collectivist individualistic issue. In the end, they seem to go together. But I mean, you could think, life requires struggle or it doesn't, and in what sense is struggle built into life at all? So that's one question, and I think we might take that up separately. And what was even meant by struggle? I mean, I have to say the word has a collectivist and kind of scary flavor in the context of talking about the meaning of life, because there's Mein Kampf, right? My struggle. And that's, and that doesn't put it in a good odor. But that's an argument from, unsavory bedfellows. So there is something right about, like, part of what we find meaning for in life is that we're doing something and it's not easy and there's work to it. On the other hand, there is a kind of idealizing of suffering and martyrdom that you get. I mean, you see this a lot in Jordan Peterson and so forth. And so I think it's a separable question from the individualism versus collectivism question is, like, what is the role of challenge, struggle, difficulty in life? And it clearly has some role in things being meaningful. If you imagine, there's the old Star Trek, not Star Trek, a Twilight Zone episode that Leonard Peikoff used to talk about, where someone gets into heaven and they've died, they're told they go to heaven, and everything they want just comes up, their way, and they go to gamble and they win every hand, and they, everything just happens exactly as they'd wish it, and they get terribly bored and come to realize they're actually in hell.
It's called A Nice Place to Visit.
A Nice Place to Visit is the episode title. And I think there's something kind of like true and significant about that idea. Like, part of life is that you're accomplishing things, and part of what it is to accomplish things is they don't come automatically or easy. But I don't think of that exactly as struggle, but I think it's an
Activity.
issue of, what is meant by
Exertion.
But there's something that gives meaning to life. It involves some kind of having to do something, some kind of resistance, some kind of work. There's a separate question, whatever that is, right, about what is the thing that does it. Like, life requires some kind of work, difficulty, struggle, challenge, whatever, to be meaningful. Is that something that's faced at the individual level, an individual faces it? Is it something that humanity faces, these existential challenges for humanity, and we have to all get together to face them, and that's what gives life meaning? Or is it at the level of our people, our race, our class, or whatever? Like, at what level does that happen? And this a passage I find really interesting. I'm reading from now Auguste Comte, who's the philosopher who coined the term altruism and is the kind of arch
French
advocate of it.
positivist.
Yeah, French positivist. Very popular in Latin America, it turns out, right? You found his stuff while you were there. Anyway.
There's a slogan of his on the flag of Brazil.
What's the slogan?
Order and progress.
Order and
in
progress.
Portuguese, of course.
Okay. No being can nobly labor for itself, save humanity. Her servants for the time being do but employ in the interest of her servants yet unborn, the products which they get from the materials collected by her servants in the past. So there's this thing, humanity, the human race as a whole, right, that can nobly labor for itself. It works. I guess that work involves some kind of struggle, and the meaning comes from that struggle maybe, or whatever it is. But whatever kind of work or doing or difficulty is involved in having a meaning for life, it's noble when it's confronted by humanity as a whole. And everybody else, everybody now, is employing in the interest of humanity's servants in the future the products which they got from the materials collected by the servants in the past. Everybody is a servant of humanity. Insofar as there's anything noble about us individuals here and now, it's to do with our service of this greater whole, humanity. And that thing is noble in itself. And I think some version of this idea is held by a lot of people. I think Comte is secularizing a religious idea. The only thing that's noble in itself is God and God's plan and God's vision, and everybody else is a servant of God insofar as they're doing something noble or meaningful or good. It's to do with God's plan or God's order, or something that God does that kind of intrinsically becomes valuable and meaningful, and everybody else gets value or meaning only through him or their connection to him. You get Comte saying that's true of humanity as a whole. And you can get somebody saying, well, it's not true of humanity as a whole, but it's true of my nation, my race, my cause, my something larger than itself. You get John McCain saying the one thing we could all agree on, right?
Country first.
So it was, country first, but he was, no, was it McCain or was it Kerry? It was John Kerry. It was in the Kerry versus Bush election. There was this poll result saying that voters were most interested in morality. And they thought the voters who were most interested in morality thought Republicans had an edge, they preferred Republicans. So the Democrats are really trying to say, no, morality is on our side too. And Kerry said, whatever beliefs divide us, the one thing that we all have in common is this idea that the measure of your character is your willingness to serve something greater than yourself. And then John McCain in the next election talked about serving. He didn't say what it was that he thought was so great you had to serve, I guess, country, but the thing that he thought was important, that you're serving something greater than yourself. So this idea that meaning comes from serving something greater than yourself. You see it all over the place, left and right in America and all these different political movements in religion. Why would meaning come from service? Why? All that is offloading to something else the idea of making your life meaningful. Your life is only meaningful or good when you serve something if that thing is itself meaningful or good. You're saying my life is a means to some end beyond itself, and it acquires its meaning, its purpose, its goodness because of the meaning, purpose, or goodness of that end. And that end beyond itself has to get its meaning or purpose in some way, either from serving something further beyond itself, or ultimately it's going to come to some ultimate end somehow. What is that ultimate end, that ultimate source of meaning? And the view that's taken in this, you have to serve something greater than yourself, is, in effect, I don't know what that ultimate source of meaning is, but it sure as hell can't be me. Something else has to be responsible for making my life meaningful. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it would take for it to do it. All I just know is that I'm not up to it.
And it seems to start with some kind of just the assumption that there's something bad about the self.
Well,
and why is that?
Well, there's that, but even more, it just feels like a kind of doctrine that's an expression of low self-esteem. I'm not enough. I can't make things meaningful. I can't make things make sense. I can't make things good. It's got to be something else that does it. I don't know what it is. And if you look at, that is the general doctrine, it has to be something greater than yourself. I'm puny, I'm incapable of making meaning, but something has to do it for me. I don't know what it is. And then if you look at any of the particular views about what it is, that it's the human race as a whole, that it's God, that it's my people or my vote, what is it that that thing is supposed to have that you're not? It's longer lasting than you are. God's supposed to last forever. Humanity, no one knows if it'll last forever, but it probably won't. And then no particular group or nation presumably will. So is longevity something has to be long lasting to be meaningful or eternal to be meaningful? I think a lot of religious people think it has to be eternal to be meaningful. But like something can be eternal and worthless. So it doesn't seem like how long lasting something is what makes it good or worthwhile. Only if it's already good or worthwhile is it good that it lasts longer. Eternal damnation is not supposed to be good in itself, just because it's eternal. So it can't be God's eternity or the human race's longevity longer than you that makes it good. There has to be something else that makes whatever the thing is good. And it seems to me like it has to be compatible with the things being finite. Because only if the thing is already good is there any value in prolonging it as long as you can. I mean, I'm interested in living longer. I'm interested in passing a life on to my son and not just and having some of my values live on in him and some of my ways and things like that. Part of why I wanted to reproduce. And I'm interested in having my society live on longer. But all because I think there's something good about my life, and I want to see it continue beyond the confines of my life. I didn't think it was good to begin with. If I got all the goodness and meaning from the thing outside of it, what would be the point? So I think there's a question of what makes a life meaningful. But in no way and to no degree is that question answered by outsourcing it to some larger whole, to some God in heaven or some society that you're part of. There's still the question of what the hell does that thing do that makes existence meaningful? And if it can do it, why can't you do it?
But what can you say to someone? You said that it seems to come from a position of lack of self-esteem, to think I'm not capable of doing something meaningful myself, so I have to look for it in some external power. I mean, some people actually do lack self-esteem. So I think maybe we could say, are we psychologically diagnosing this ideological position? And if so, what can you say to get them out of that funk, to change their mind on this issue?
Maybe that's a question for Gina to have on there. But I do think that
put in the broadest philosophic terms,
ideological positions have a lot to do with psychology. I mean, that is, they are philosophical ideological positions are articulations of ways of thinking and ways of functioning, which are embodied in people's individual psychology. And one can think about them philosophically, and one should, like, is this true? Is this right? Does this have evidence for it? Can I tell that it's right? And I think in good psychotherapy, that's part of what one does. One thinks about one's core beliefs, the beliefs that are driving one and shaping one's life, and one subjects them to scrutiny, one reality checks them, one thinks about. But I think part of it's not mere psychologizing or mere ad hominem argument to say that what a view amounts to is a statement of helplessness, a statement that amounts to I don't think very much of myself. I don't have much self-esteem. There's now the question of whether that's true. Maybe we should feel that way. Maybe we as human beings tend to be hubristic, or some of us do, and think that we have more power than we can. Than is possible to us, that we are in charge of our lives when we're not, that we are the captains of our own ships. We're really just bits of flotsam tossed about. But I think that's really the question, which is true there. And I gave reasons earlier to think that we're not just bits of flotsam. There's a lot of pushback that those reasons could get, and there were things to say back to them. We've only had devil's advocates as opposed to devils, or anyway, people who are really holding the opposite position.
See if some devils show up later.
But
I mean, so what you talked about earlier was the free will idea, which, in your way of putting it, has to do with your power to seek the truth or not. Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like one thing you're saying to someone who's in this existential funk is, you have that power. You can use your mind to figure out what's true in the world, mm-hmm. But put it this way, the average Joe doesn't fancy himself a philosopher who's trying to figure out the truths about the big questions in life. What would give his life meaning is seemingly something more concrete than that.
But finding the truth isn't.
Why? What can you offer to him?
But finding the truth isn't just about philosophy. It's finding the truth on any kind of matter, great or small. Philosophy is a kind of background for that, and I think we all need to do some of it at some times in our lives to take control of our lives, to become fully who we're capable of being. But life's not about doing philosophy unless that's what you choose to specialize in. There are lots of different, pursuits that are great as part of a life, and philosophy is one of them. And if you think you have a particular aptitude for it, or particular love for it, you can make that the center of your life. But for most people, it's just one part, and one of the other things is the center. Finding the truth isn't just about being a philosopher. It's part of any kind of honest thinking, and honest thinking, I think, is essential to any kind of good living. But it's not yet. I mean, you wanted to transition from the kind of epistemic topic, how do we know what's true, to where do values come from, where do meaning come from. And I think there's sort of more to life than just finding out truths that you're not going to do anything with. There's also, in addition to discovering knowledge, forming values. And there's a process of forming values which is, I think, closely akin to the process of forming knowledge, but they're not, the same. They're all intertwined. That is where meaning comes from in life.
There's a passage in The Fountainhead which deals directly with a number of the issues we've been talking about. This is, of course, the book by Ayn Rand, and in part 4, chapter 5, is this conversation between the hero of the book, Howard Roark, and Gail Wynand. And let me read a couple paragraphs from this and tell me
I was thinking
your
of
thoughts
this passage earlier, if it's the one
about
you're
this.
thinking.
Roark says, I was thinking of people who say happiness is impossible on earth. Look how hard they all try to find some joy in life. Look how they struggle for it. Why should any living creature exist in pain? By what conceivable right can anyone demand that a human being exist for anything but his own joy? Every one of them wants it. Every part of him wants it. But they never find it. I wonder why. They whine and they say they don't understand the meaning of life. There's a particular kind of people that I despise. Those who seek some sort of a higher purpose or a universal goal, who don't know what to live for, who moan that they must find themselves. You hear it all around us. That seems to be the official bromide of our century. Every book you open, every drooling self-confession, it seems to be the noble thing to confess. I think it would be the most shameful one. Actually, that was Wynand speaking. And here's Roark. Look, Gail. Roark got up, reached out, tore a thick branch off a tree, held in both hands, one fist closed at each end. Then his wrists and knuckles tensed against the resistance. He bent the branch slowly into an arc. Now I can make what I want of it, a bow, spear, a cane, a railing. That's the meaning of life. And Wynand asks, your strength? And Roark says, your work. He tossed the branch aside, the material the earth offers you and what you make of it. What are you thinking of, Gail? It goes on from there. But it's interesting that Gail there, his initial take on the gesture is your strength. And he's coming from a slightly different perspective from Roark. It's more of the struggle perspective. It's more of the exerting power over others perspective.
There's also a bitterness in Wynand, in his contempt for the typical view that's not there in Roark. I think Roark, equally with Wynand, doesn't hold that view that you have to find yourself, you can never be happy on life, you have to always look for something, and it's noble to say, I don't know what I want out of life. But the fact that deficit is so common in the world, that I'm complaining of too, like when I talk about what's lacking in people who aren't individualistic, the fact that deficit is so common in the world seems like the most important thing to Gail, right, to Wynand. He's kind of obsessed with that fact. He's very upset about it. He's ruminating on it. Dealing with that fact about other people is kind of a shaping force in his life, whereas for Roark, it's something he kind of takes in stride. Other people haven't grasped this thing that I've grasped it, about how to make what matters in life. And part of what Rourke is thinking there is that Winan doesn't fully grasp it. And I think that's why he answers him not by saying, yeah, those people suck or whatever, but by saying that here's the thing that they're looking for, and you yourself don't quite have it. But I think, yeah, so that's an account of where the meaning in life comes from. Where does it come from? Well, Rourke thinks of it as lying in your work. So there's the issue of there's something you might call struggle, the struggle to attempt to make the thing the shape you want it. And there is struggle inherent in work. There's effort inherent in work. But what's important to Rourke about it is not just the struggle, or primarily the struggle, but that it's, the way Rand puts it in Atlas Shrugged, is reshaping the world in the image of your values. So if what you are as an individual is someone who's capable of thinking for yourself, someone who's capable of knowing the world for yourself, of figuring out what's true, also what you're capable of is coming up with ideas, conceiving of new ways things can be, basing them on knowledge of your needs, of the needs of human beings as a species, of your particular needs, of your particular abilities, coming up with all that knowledge as a background, things that could be, and then committing to them and trying to make them be. And those things are values. You have reasons to think they're good, that they would serve human needs and so forth. And you then, go out and try to pursue them. And it's in that process of creating things, pursuing things, shaping the world in the image of your values, that the meaning of life consists, at least for Rourke and for Rand. And it's precisely because what you're doing is shaping the world in the image of your values, things you've conceived and thought of. That human life is inherently individualistic, because conceiving, thinking of, planning, projecting is something that we do, each of us with his own mind, and then we cooperate. But the cooperation is based on each of us having goals that we thought out and are trying to achieve.
That language of shaping the earth in the image of your own values, I've always thought was a conscious twist on the God creating the earth in his own image language from the Bible, which, if you think about it, this is a good way to try to convey to people why this particular individualistic activity is pretty meaningful. I mean, none of the people who have skepticism about this are going to say, "Oh, God creates the universe. That's not meaningful." They see creation as a meaningful activity. What if you can create your own little universe, in effect? Now, not in the literal sense, but if what you're doing when you're creating a life for yourself is filling it with the values and the people and the relationships and the projects that constitute, in effect, your own world of values, why wouldn't anyone see that as meaningful? That sounds like exactly what meaning is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way of taking the argument you just made, and having it start with like God as your standard. You have this idea of God and what he does must be meaningful. So if you could do the same kind of thing on a small scale, wouldn't that kind of
Really the other way
too?
around.
Yeah, but I think
They stole it from
what
us.
what you have to think about is like, is this where my idea of God comes from? Is this the kind of, when I think of God and think of him as something good, where am I getting that idea and getting the idea of the goodness of it from? And maybe it's from this activity that I recognize as good and that I can come to see is within my own scope. And I'm kind of, reifying it into something that it exists just as this activity, apart from anyone to do it. Because I mean, there are a whole lot of questions about God and God having plans and activities that it's not clear that they're comprehensible. I mean, the whole idea of creating something, right, comes from you create it out of something for some purpose to fulfill some need, something that had no needs and that was able to accomplish anything just by thinking it without having to have intermediate steps to do it, which is part of what it would be to be omnipotent. It's hard to know what it would mean for that thing to have plans. What would it need the plans for? And what would it, the means end reasoning, it's kind of hard to make sense of in the idea of omnipotence. So you might think that part of what's going on when we think of a creator God is that we're we are taking something that we recognize and value in ourselves or in other people around us, and we're kind of porting it to another context that's supposed to kind of make it pure or fully that way. But it might be that we're porting it outside of the context that makes it reasonable, makes it make sense.
As Nietzsche asked, is God man's mistake, or is man God's mistake?
So you're saying, Juan's saying, Nietzsche asked if man was God's mistake or God man's. Yeah, I mean, on this view, God would be man's, but put aside the issue of whether it's a mistake. It's like, insofar as there's something appealing in that idea, where does that appeal come from? And I mean to ask that to each person individually, because maybe the appeal comes from, I feel weak and helpless and you know, I want to picture something strong. But where do I get the idea of this? I'm thinking of that as a kind of maybe less savory thing that might appeal to you about God than some other ones. But even if you think about that, where do I get the idea of this kind of strength? I haven't had a direct encounter with God. Where have I encountered? Well, maybe my parents were strong, or the people around me, or my sister, whatever it was, and that's where I get the idea that I'm then, you know, attributing to God being this sort of more fully.
And it is interesting that even if you step outside of the bounds of religion to more secular versions of meaning that's supposed to lie outside the individual, to make any of it plausible, it usually has to rely on some kind of analogy to an individual. Like if society is an organism, it's still an organism that has a brain and that has, you know, appendages. And where do we get the idea of that? We get it by looking at the way actual individuals function and then trying to project those qualities onto society or to the race or something like that.
Yeah, and if you take the Comte, no being can nobly labor for herself save humanity, her servants for the time being, and so forth. You're thinking of humanity as, in effect, an individual with servants, like a king or a slave master or something, and that other things get their nobility through their relationship to the master. And they're just thinking of humanity as you know, the slave master and us as her slaves. A lot of, you know, religious reasoning is the same metaphor. God's the master and we're God's servants, which is to say slaves. Or maybe we're not slaves because we do it willingly on some versions of religion, but we achieve our meaning by being willing servants.
There's plenty in if not the Gospels, then in like the letters of the apostles, describing us as slaves in positive light. If not there certainly is an Augustine. There's an article I tweeted about recently, but basically, if you're trying to find the Christian basis for abolitionism, you'll have to exclude a whole lot of Augustine's theology because it's not there. If anything, he celebrates it.
I mean, part of what's interesting is, if you're going to talk about something like this, you can't say the abolitionist movement as it existed was very Christian in the kind of simple demographics. A lot of it took place in churches, people who viewed themselves as Christians, who saw this as related to their Christianity, who functioned by pointing out to other Christians that what they're doing is unchristian in their way of thinking. But there's a question as to, when you look at any ideology, sort of what is it in essence, right? Like, when you think of a church as your moral institution in a society, and the church is connected to a sacred text, which has been interpreted a lot of different ways in a lot of different generations in a lot of different places, what's going on in the pews of a given church at a given time is not wholly, and maybe isn't even primarily, determined by the content of its sacred book or the traditions that it's part of. Those are one input to what's going on, but there are other inputs. Otherwise, there wouldn't be different sects of religions. And a Calvinist from 1508 and a Calvinist from 2008 would be just the same in what they valued and cared about, and they're really, really different, right? Even if they're all Lutherans or all Methodists. So there are other kind of components going into even the content of what we think of as religious morality than the religious tradition. And if you're thinking about like, is the emancipatory impulse from Christianity, or is it coming from somewhere else? Is Christianity a force for freedom or slavery? You can't answer it by saying, well, did the people who are on this or that side of it profess to be Christians? In fact, the people on both sides profess to be Christians. Whatever the difference is, it's not coming from that they call themselves Christians. It's coming from somewhere else. And then we can think about, as we understand Christianity in its essence, which side is right to think of themselves as the more Christians. And it might be that the better side was right to think of themselves as better, but wrong to think of themselves as more Christian, or, right to think of themselves as more Christian. It's like a separate question.
And here's two things to say about what that additional factor might have been, apart from the traditional doctrine that they both shared. One's the more obvious point. The second is the subtler but really interesting point. The first is, obviously, this is an impetus that happens in the post-Enlightenment period of Europe, where all of Western religion has by this point been influenced by one strain or another of individualistic thinking, right, which didn't happen in the 1,000 years prior of Christian doctrine. That's, I think, the more obvious point. But the point I find increasingly fascinating is that when you look at the strains of Christian religion that were the most adamantly involved in the abolitionist movement, usually you think of the Quakers, right? Well, what was special about the Quakers? In this period, they're one of the few Christian strains that was increasingly critical of the doctrine of original sin. They were even semi-Pelagian, as they put it, which is...
You might want to say what the Pelagian fallacy is.
They think that they believed in the perfectibility of man. The standard original sin doctrine is that we are all sinners. It's inevitable. The clearest version of this is the Calvinist version, where your fate is predestined and you're totally up to God's election and not anything about your choice. Now the Quakers are only semi-Pelagian, so they still have to allow for God's grace somehow, but they think that we still, if we don't mess up, if we choose not to mess up, we can still accept God's grace and be perfectible, and escape sin completely. And that is another example of the connection between the metaphysical issue of free will and the doctrine of individualism, because here they have the view, look, we're not doomed to be sinners. We don't have to acquiesce in the existing social institutions just because everybody around us supports slavery and there's this peculiar institution that's been established for hundreds of years. Doesn't mean we have to accept it. We can challenge it and perfect our souls. And they did it to one degree or another.
There's also, if we're thinking about this whole thing in the history of Western religion or European and American religion and how it relates to individualism and social movements, there's individualism is often associated with Protestantism, on the idea that you can interpret the Bible as an individual versus going through the church as an institution doing it, right? I've always been a bit skeptical of that.
I am of that too.
I think it's hard to come out with people with a less individualist doctrine than Calvinism, and of course Calvin runs a totalitarian state. But I do think that there's a kind of tension in religious thinking between free will and moral responsibility on the one hand, and determinism on the other. And I think, and figuring out what's true on your own versus in groups and authority structures, that I think is kind of breaking out into the open in the kind of Reformation and Counter-Reformation period. These issues are kind of constantly being thought about.
Absolutely.
And there's also a question of what individualism is, because there's a sense in which Protestant religion and Puritan religion is very individualistic as opposed to Catholicism. It's stressing your personal relationship with God. I mean, Catholicism a little bit, but the feeling of God appeals to you personally. There's a lot more personalistic language. But interestingly, it's at least in some strains of this tradition, a lot less reason-focused language. He touches your heart. All of this, again, is in there's biblical language that this picks up on. But there's a stress on the individual, but not on the individual understood as a reasoning being. And then you have, both in Catholic countries and in Protestant countries, people who are really thinking of the individual as a reasoning being, and you're then trying to think of religion in that terms, and starting out with people who are theists, Locke and Descartes also, right? That is, take countries on different sides of this divide, and also people who are coming out of, I think also important to understanding the Enlightenment and the stress on reason, coming out of a period of religious warfare, and thinking there has to be a better way to deal with people than this.
Well, we've been going over an hour, so should we? We've put a lot on the table for people to ask us questions.
I want to, if anyone here with us in person wants to talk or bring up any issues, you can go over to the microphone, or if any of our friends online. I don't know how many friends there are online.
There is one comment from Tyler on something we were talking about earlier in connection with the self-esteem question. He says, I think there's more to this sentiment than low self-esteem, the sentiment that was supposed to empower the belief in the necessity of collectivism. There's also discontent, dissatisfaction, because their expectations of what meaning should be are flawed. I'd be curious if Tyler had more to say about what he meant by that, but do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, if you're dissatisfied, but you're not trying to solve it yourself, you're expecting it to come from without. That's part of what I'm thinking about is you don't have a do it yourself attitude. But yeah, I mean, there's this idea. I don't know. Let me tell a kind of silly anecdote, maybe, but it was something that was meaningful in my life. When I was a little kid, I really liked Christmas. And it was cool, like the whole world just got awesome in December. There were trees up and there was special music. Like the whole world became Christmassy and it was awesome. And sometime like when I was a teenager, December started getting lame. Like I had this expectation, everything's going to be awesome and cool and exciting, and it's just like, that's a dude in a suit at the mall, and like, this ad's dumb, and I don't like this song, and like, I'm at this Christmas party with my relatives, and they're all right, but somehow it's not like it was when I was a kid, when it was special, and, and then when I was around 20, I thought, what am I kind of grousing about? Christmas is not as cool as it was when I was 8, and thinking like, oh, I'll never recapture the magic of childhood. And this is bullshit. Like, why don't I figure out what I'd like to do? And how can I make this thing meaningful? And it's like, it's up to me to make December Christmassy if I want it to be Christmassy. I could either like give up on this tradition, or I can like decide a way to make it important to me. And I started doing things, and I had a party, and I wrote a paper about the significance of holidays, and I gave a little talk and had people over my house. And I know, because maybe they're little nerdy things that are distinctive to, and I wrote a song about, but like, I was like, what can I do to imbue this thing with meaning? It's up to me to make my life what I want it to be. And I was at the time, and still am, proud of that reaction to the Christmas thing. And it's something I think that's part of growing up, is to take responsibility for making your life have the richness that you want it to have, spiritually as well as in terms of possession. And we all start as kids without having the responsibility to do that for ourselves. Other people provide for us physically, and other people make different times things special by giving us treats and rewards and decorating the house. But part of growing up is realizing you have to do it yourself. And if when you get to the point of like, I'm dissatisfied, things aren't special like I thought they'd be, the disillusionment Tyler's talking about feels to me a bit like that. And what I think of as the kind of selfish, self-esteem, individualistic, proper thing to do is at some point like to say, all right, it's up to me to make this thing what I want it to be, to make it meaningful, to figure out if there's something real about that standard that I have that I'm disappointed is not being met, and then make it real by bringing it into reality, rather than letting it be a stillborn aspiration. And I'm not criticizing someone for feeling that sense of disappointment, because one has to go through that stage of saying like, well, things aren't automatically the way I want them to be. They're not automatically living up to the kind of promissory note for what a life could be that I had when I was a baby, when I was a kid. I think you have to come up against that. So it's nothing wrong with feeling that dissatisfaction. But I think then there's this next step of, at some point you have to say, okay, do I want this to be real or not? Do I think there's something right about this kind of valuing and aspiration and so forth? And if I do, then what am I going to do about it? Or am I just going to like poo-poo that there's no, oh, Christmas is too commercial and everything's all bullshit, and be like some like, whiny, cynical kid who thinks that nothing has any meaning?
Brings to mind the Houseman poem that Rand would every once in a while reference, "The stranger and afraid in a world I never made," and her response to it was, "Why didn't you?"
Yeah, I mean, this is a really great poem by A. House. I forget the name of the poem, but
I think it's
but how am I to face the odds of? But I mean,
the laws of God, the laws of man.
yeah, it's a little what he's on about in that poem, because he takes different perspectives. It's a little flip as a response to the poem to say, why didn't you make the world? But if just that sentiment taken in isolation and that aspect of the poem, I think that is, I mean, the answer I'm giving, basically.
I could also speculate that part of the Christmas problem there was living in New Jersey, but that's
What's the problem?
that's a
with
little
New
too
Jersey for
collectivist
Christmas?
on my part to say.
What was the problem living in New Jersey when I was like 20 and this issue first came up?
I said I'm not going to say it because it's too collectivist for me to say.
All right. Oh, it's not Wisconsin, or where's Christmas good?
Places where there's snow.
Effortlessly. There's snow. Not as much. All right. We have Jen dressed in all black, like the kind of nihilist kid disappointed in
boy.
the world I was just referencing.
Don't give them
Nice
what they
emo.
want.
Emo?
Thank you, Ben.
Everyone's in all black here, except Noel. You got white under with your thoughtful gorilla on it. Yeah.
Can I ask my questions?
And
All
she
right.
asked her,
Yeah. Jen, come on.
So what is it about your work or your creative powers that makes life meaningful? Is it just the self-expressive, self-assertive aspect of it? Or the fact that you could say, I'm responsible for this, in which case, is it really just all about sort of building up or demonstrating to yourself and inflating your own self-esteem? Or is it sort of the use value of the things that you create? The end product are now things that you can engage with in the world that you wished you could have before, and now things are a little bit more convenient, a little more to your tastes. I mean, it is, I could see, this is all kind of like devil's advocate, but I could see somebody saying that, okay, you set a bunch of goals and you accomplish them and then you die, but every goal that you set for yourself is just sort of a little ritualized passion play to exert and relive the fact that you can overcome a challenge, and maybe other animals can't do that the way you can, and it makes you feel good. But is it just that it makes you feel good? Is that what makes life meaningful? And then should it? And then also I could see that perspective then putting more emphasis on the struggle. Like the product is almost not even that big of a deal if it's all just about demonstrating to yourself that you can overcome a challenge, and that's the creative power. So what's sort of the positive side of the creative power? What's that for?
Yeah, I think that's a really deep question. So you first brought up the Rourke quote. Do you want to talk about it, or should?
yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on this issue a little bit already, but it's worth thinking about what kind of concept the concept of meaning is. It's strongly connected to the concept of purpose. So if something gives you meaning because you mean to do it, because you mean to accomplish a purpose, and purpose it's a teleological concept. It's a concept related to means and ends. And so one thing you have to think about here is, well, what do we need these concepts for? Why do we need what purpose do they serve in our thinking? To identify a means to an end, and to say that something is satisfied about our life when we fulfill the end, when we find the means to that end. And I mean, in Rand's view, at least, there's her view is that you mentioned human beings are different from animals, and we can see ourselves as special. But I mean, her view is that it's the whole phenomenon of living organisms as such that gives rise to the need for these kind of teleological concepts, and that we need purposes we need goals because we need values in our life. We need to pursue certain things in order to stay in existence. And it's not that we check off some boxes and get the things we need and then just coast. It's life is a virtuous cycle building on itself of self-sustaining activity. One means to an end, which is itself a means to an end. And part of the thinking that people have about meaning and purpose is often this static approach to it, where like you get to the end and that's it, and now everything's over. But Rand's view is that life, both for human beings and for the non-human world, is an end in itself, in the sense that it's an ongoing cycle, and a virtuous cycle, and it's not static. And so the struggle isn't the activity that you engage in isn't to get to that end and now you can be static and coast. It's meaningful as long as it is building more and more on itself.
Aristotle has a kind of quip, because he's always talking about ends, and of somebody who said at a funeral, he has now reached the end for the sake of which he lived. In other words, being a corpse. And there's and the comment is made, and we have to understand what it is to be an end, not just to be the terminus or the output of something. Okay, but then what are we to understand it as, right? Because when you have a means end way of thinking, when you're thinking of something in terms of means and ends, you're evaluating the means as valuable because of the value of the pre-existent value of the end, and the fact that the means is a means to the end. So you're kind of punting on the question of value or meaning whenever you identify something as a means to the end. And then if that end is meaningful or valuable as a means to a further end, so you're punting to whatever turns out to be the ultimate end. And it turns out that whenever we get to questions of the value of ultimate ends or the meaning of ultimate purposes, we're kind of vague on them, right? I mean, I don't mean we have to be, but we tend to be. It's a lot easier to think about if you just assume something as a goal, like how is something else valuable as a means to it. And so there's like a lot of thinking and debates in the history of philosophy about like, where do ends come from? Are they just matters of our emotions? Are they just, and you can see all the sides of those debates in the way you were framing your question. So it was like, well, is it just the feeling that you get? Well, then why is that feeling good? And so everything is just about feelings, and so ends become subjective, just a matter of your feeling. Or if it's about the fact that you're doing something in your struggle and activity, then maybe the meaning isn't in the product at all, but it's just in what you do. And there you get Stoicism. The only things of value with your own activity, and the goals of the activity are just kind of incidental to that. And so you can see like there's a whole like history of philosophy complex around this, which is just a way of saying there's something hard here and something interesting to notice about our thinking, apart from any particular answer to it, about like when we get to the issue of ultimate ends, ultimate meanings, there's a kind of difficulty, and people find it hard to articulate what it is. And what we tend to do, part of what is to punt it to something else. Well, society figures it out or whatever. Society gives it meaning. If it's not my own feelings, it must be society as a whole, or maybe God does it. How does God do it? I don't know. I don't know what kind of goals God could have or how his having goals could make anything meaningful for anyone else. But, he's not me, so maybe he does it. So that there's a kind of sense that there's a difficulty in creating meaning. What is the answer? I mean, I think there's something a little bit wrong with the way we think about means-end relationships. So you can think of a means-end relationship as the means has no value. It's a worthless, neutral thing. And it gets its value solely from the end, which has the value wholly in itself, intrinsically, apart from any means to it. And there are things that are these bearers of value in itself, which we don't really even understand what that kind of value in itself could be. And then there are other things that just get their value by like being connected to those other things. And when you think of it that way, the topic of ultimate value seems very mysterious, and the topic of instrumental or means value seems very clear. Well, it gets it causally. But The way I think of value and meaning, it's much more like a circuit. The end is only valuable insofar as it's something reachable, and the means are part of what gives the end value. So I think of it as I think of it like the whole thing. The fact that there's something achievable by you by a certain means, that serves a need that you have. And I think that's the part that Ben was bringing out by the biological part of it. That serves a need that you have. That whole structure. There's a need that you have. It's a kind of survival-based need. You'll be in pain or you'll die if you don't get it satisfied. There's something you can do to achieve it, and you have this plan that you've come up with in light of your abilities and your needs. I think that whole thing is the kind of genesis of value, but it's not a unidirectional relationship where what you're really aiming at is getting the need satisfied. Rather, the thing that's the ultimate aim in life is the life, the activity, which gets its identity from several different facts that give rise to it. One, that there are these needs. Two, that there's the suite of abilities by which you can satisfy the needs. And three, that you've constructed something to make your own life about, which project life about manages to satisfy the needs via using the tools available.
And that's where the work part
And that's
comes in.
what the work is.
Putting it together.
But I think, yeah, it's then why is that meaningful? Why is that whole thing valuable? Well, whenever you get to what's going to be the ultimate value or the ultimate meaningful thing, what do we mean by asking why is it meaningful or why is it valuable? It can't possibly have an answer of the sort that other things have. It's meaningful as a means to this other thing or valuable as a means to this other thing. So there's this other question of like, what does it mean to justify something as an ultimate value or show what its status as an ultimate value is? And I think it's to sort of, in abstract theoretical terms, it's to see how it's the phenomenon that gives rise to valuing and that makes sense of this whole constellation of things. And then in practical terms for an individual life, you're saying, yeah, that's some kind of technical answer about what reasoning about ends amounts to. It's a thing that enables you to put a life together for yourself and care about it. And I think that's a kind of psychological, personal perspective on it. And this is something I've thought about more and more over the years and have written about a lot in connection to Rand, so that because I think it was very central to her thinking and her development and very central to what has inspired me about her work. So my kind of attempt to spell all this out is the chapter 3 of the book, A Companion to Ayn Rand, which is on, I forget now what it's called, the active value, values and the active value, I think.
By the way, Michael, we didn't see the Jen on camera for that, I don't think.
At my request.
Oh, she didn't. Oh, okay.
Okay, so someone's got to come on camera so we can have the very well-framed shot that Michael set up for that.
He said I could choose.
You can choose. No, totally, that's fine. But now I'm just kind of trying to guilt one of them into coming on so we could use the shot. Are we getting anything else online? We've been going, plenty long.
Yeah.
I think we're perfectly entitled to call it a wrap. And apparently we've solved our audio issues.
So it seems. Tyler did follow up a bit on his earlier
People are still
comment.
going to complain that we're not using condenser mics, but I continue to insist condenser mics are not good for live applications where there are multiple people.
On that issue of satisfaction, Tyler said to say a bit more, there are two directions to find something like one's creative work lacking inward in oneself and outward and something lacking in the world or product. He said both errors are sides of the same coin. And then adding to what Jen asked about, there's something about finding meaning in one's work that isn't found in something like playing a game, but both involve self-assertion. So,
Yeah, because playing a game itself
is
involves self-assertive and I don't think you can really fully find meaning in art, for example, even in creating it, unless you're seeing it as sustaining you and serving a human need. If it's just something you do as a hobby, I think there's a real difference between one's hobbies and one's vocation.
And one problem with saying that what it is about work that gives life meaning is that it's a game that you play with yourself. Well, the whole idea of a game presupposes a contrast with work. You can't even make sense of that concept unless you think that, well, games are things that simulate some kind of real goal pursuit, but that means there's real goal pursuit that you can simulate.
To call something a game is to downgrade it by comparison to a higher standard of purposiveness and there's a kind of, you're thinking kind of stolen concept
Yeah.
there. I mean,
One
yeah,
problem with Wittgenstein's view of language, but
that's plausible. Although with all of those kinds of issues of stolen concept, there's the issue of maybe there's nothing like we thought there was, and that's the I'm exposing a kind of because you could say, like, I can imagine somebody trying to argue for God or immortality
ontological argument.
in a kind of similar way of saying, well, there has to be something that fully fulfills this standard I have. Otherwise, I couldn't see something as not living up to it. And if the thing is really properly a standard, I think there's something that's right about that, but it might not be a rational standard
And
to
there's
begin
when
with.
there's like direct observational evidence of the contrast that you're invoking, it's important.
So what I mean is a game versus work, but it turns out that work is game-like after all in some way. I don't know. I think there's something right about that, but I want to think a little bit more about it. Okay. Any last thoughts or comments from the assembled multitude or minitude? What's the name for a small group?
Peanut gallery.
From the peanut gallery? Just throw some peanuts at us. Yeah. You guys are writing stuff, so you're passing notes. I want to hear what you're passing. Do you have anything to share with the rest of the group?
Maybe another day.
Maybe another day? All right, so you can go on mic without camera, though. We could do the same thing.
It wasn't really a question or comment, but I just found it interesting. I can go here.
Just so we'll hear you better. So.
Yeah. It's not really a comment or a question. Or I mean, it's just, I guess it's just a thing that I noticed when you were talking about earlier, especially when you specifically use the word outsourcing with responsibility or meaning and duty. We were talking about the collectivism versus individual sense of. I think you were talking about meaning, but I wrote down that relegation or outsourcing because I like when you use the word outsourcing of individual decision. What does that say? Onto the collective is like that's a drop of responsibility or a backwards induction for blame placement or duty placement based on a contract agreement. And so I just wanted to get I wanted to say that, but also wanted to get your take on it to see whether that's correct.
Can you say that again a little more slowly? I'm not sure I'm following.
Yeah, because you're talking about outsourcing. I don't know if it was meaning. I forgot what specifically you were referencing, but you said the word outsourcing, and I found it interesting. And
the idea, I think what I was saying is there's a problem there's a question of what makes your life meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something that must be done, presumably. Something must be functioning in a certain way for there to be meaning. And there's a question of what is that way? What needs to be done to generate meaning? And a lot of views I'm saying don't actually answer that question. They just point to something or someone else that's supposed to do it, although we still don't know what it is, and say, well, that thing, gives me meaning. What does it do that gives you meaning? How is it able to give you meaning? You don't know. I was thinking you're kind of punting or outsourcing the question of how to get the meaning to this other entity that you don't know. It doesn't help solve the problem unless you could say something about what it does that provides meaning. That's how I was thinking about it. But it sounds like you were taking the outsourcing language and thinking of it in, if you're talking about contracts and stuff, in a way that's kind of connected to literal outsourcing, like we hire a firm to do something.
Yeah, and I was
wanna
thinking
hear-
that along the lines of with collectivism or with the collective meaning, or say with concepts like nationalism or any other way of finding identity. Because I think we were talking about identity specifically, and it was more I think. It's surrounding the concept that if for an individual to think, because you were mentioning earlier, and I usually say this to my friends, is that something that makes humans human is the thing. I think you said that they think that it's thinking, and I just say to my friends just like a dog wags its tail unconsciously or subconsciously without actual meaning or purpose behind its wagging its tail, so do humans think. And so I think that's what I was connecting it to, where it's when you're trying to make individual decision. Or if you're trying to reflect it onto the collective, you're basically just dropping off responsibility onto something else, onto saying this is the group identity, it was God, or it was whatever.
So I see that, how you're trying to put the responsibility onto the other thing. That's something I was saying. But how that relates to the dog's tail wagging. So that a dog is going to wag its tail whether it wants to. It just does it.
Yeah.
And so the idea is similarly, we just think.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think that's right, and in a way, I think it's not. So it's
It sounded like he was saying that when people outsource, they default on a responsibility to
Of
think.
thinking, yeah,
So
they
it's
basically-
possible to do it that way, but that's not maybe the ideal.
Yeah, at least I was thinking that that's something that happens when you look at at least some parts of, I guess, some parts of different history, or like whatever is considered the identity in different historical eras. Whether it be like the Catholic Church and it's like, oh, the church, or whether it be feudalism and it's the king, or say Egypt and the pharaoh. That kind of decision making or individual, I guess decision to make meaning or decision to anything is usually just relegated or outsourced to someone else.
to someone else.
Yeah, and then I was thinking about how that kind of plays into how did it even come to that? How did it even get to that point? And I was just thinking that it would be along the lines of like, say, maybe like an alignment of incentives, and then eventually that incentive just becomes habit, where you say someone else is just continuously benefited or gain some form of benefit towards my incentives. So it just becomes a contractual agreement that you'll do the thinking and you'll do all of this, and I'll just do the, I don't know, labor or the whatever, and accept whatever moralistic or meaning based arguments that you make.
I mean, in a way, this is related to the question we were discussing earlier about how is it that people can really be individuals if they have to count on other people, whether they're parents or their teachers or whatever. And you made the point that, well, yes, there are ways in which we all have to rely on others, but we still have to exert the responsibility of understanding the things that people teach us. And in the material realm, we still have to engage, we still have to do the work of creating a value to trade with other people. And if you think about actual outsourcing, when you're actually outsourcing labor to have something manufactured in another country or whatever, normally, presumably the manufacturer is gonna, or the company that sells the product, they're gonna do some research into like, is this factory in China actually going to be able to produce my goods effectively and up to the standards that I want,
And is it
my
best-
customers?
is this right?
But then eventually also it becomes.
But that's not what's happening, right? When
Yeah.
you're outsourcing your meaning in life, because there you're saying, I don't even want to be the one to decide whether or not someone else is a good enough outsourcer. They're the ones who are going to decide for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a kind of division there because there are lots of things that you can rely on other people for. So long as there's some ultimate buck stops here where you're judging have they done a good job at it, right? So you can, if you're not being the place where the buck stops, where you're judging are they doing a good job of it, then I think you are defaulting on doing the thinking you need your life to do. You need to do to have your life be meaningful and to live well. And if we think about periods in history that were dominated by more than we are now, the Pharaoh makes all the decisions and we don't question him and we just do whatever the Pharaoh said. You're talking about periods where there were thousands of years of stagnation and everybody was living pretty badly.
Yeah.
So I think there are, it's not just, there's something spiritually impoverished or you're not living up to your human stature. I think you're also starving and dying early, and there's non-accidental bad things that happen as a result of that.
Yeah, no, that's what I was saying. That's what I was saying, or at least that's what I was thinking along the lines of, is that it's not good. When you were saying like it is your responsibility or whatever, it's also think of like, how does that just incentive wise? How do you get to even the point of re-incentivizing you to take control or ownership of that? And I was thinking maybe it's more along the lines of, instead of saying like the buck stops here and that's like beneficial enough or anything, it's more of this, things have gotten bad enough that just the incentive towards not committing violence is not there anymore, and then you just revolt. And you see that in revolutions. You see that in like the French Revolution. You see that in the American Revolution. It's typically not so much of a I'm letting them decide what I want, and eventually you say I've let them decide enough times, and it's compounded enough to a problem that violence is just a better answer, and just starting from scratch is better than and taking bits and pieces from the things I like than continuing on this track.
Couple of these social causes. Like what gives rise to the incentive to, what is the psychology and the social psychology of people defaulting, if there's this kind of unalienable responsibility to kind of make something of your own life, and a lot of people default on it, and maybe more people default on it in some periods than others. That's arguable whether that's true. What is the kind of cause of that sociologically, psychologically, and then what is the cause of periods where people do, take up responsibility for themselves. You're saying the cause of people taking up things have gotten bad enough that we're not going to take it anymore. And then you give us examples, political revolutions and like that. I'm skeptical about that as a cause of political revolution because I think, just as a matter of historical record, it's not the case that political revolutions typically happen when things get worse, when things are at the low. This is the last straw, and they typically happen when
Rising
things
expectations.
have gotten better, but not enough better quickly, or have been getting better and then get a little worse. So I don't think it's that political revolutions happen because the population has hit rock bottom. I think they happen because they've been inspired to want more. And a set of circumstances have come up where their aspirations are not, there's a gap between their aspirations and their life that there wasn't before. And there are a bunch of ways that can come up, but usually it's not, things have just gotten so much worse. It's usually things have gotten better and their ability to project even better still has now outstripped things, or things were getting better and then started getting worse, something like that. And people have written on this. I don't have a, super command of all the revolutions history, but I think that tends to be what happened with political revolutions.
But is part of what he was asking, in effect, what incentivizes people to outsource meaning and values?
Yeah.
Is that kind of the essence
That's
of
what I
your
was
question?
also like. That's what I was like trying to also figure out. Or that's what I was thinking about was, the incentives to outsourcing. And then because if say eventually you become miserable because you've outsourced it enough, what are you gonna do then? Like what do you do then?
I think there's a way to answer that question, but there's another way in which you might not be able to answer the question because it presupposes that it's motivated by a positive conception of one's self-interest. And there's kind of psychological egoism there, the assumption that everybody is motivated by self-interest all the time. And even as we are here, we've been talking about individualism, which has real clear connections to self-interest. It's still an individualism that's closely connected to the issue of free will, and people have a choice about whether they care about what's true, whether they care about what's good for their lives. And so there's a level
form
on
a conception of their own interest.
Yeah.
But you can think of it in take just a normal vanilla case of someone not doing anything with their life. There are all these what are called failures to launch, right? The people they get out of college, they get out of whatever higher level of education they're put through, and they just sit in their parents' basement and don't know what to do, and they don't. And it's not it'd be perfectly respectable to live at your parents' house, but they're not living there because this is the first stage of their plan, and they're trying to figure out what to do. They're just kind of coasting in life. They don't want to face the responsibility. What is the incentive there? There's one way that you can think about it as it's an issue of incentives, and then what are their incentives? But it's a kind of economic way of thinking about it, where you think in the background, everybody's driven by the same thing. There's some bottom line that everybody's trying to achieve. And then we know that's a kind of axiom of how people work. And then we try to figure out what it is and how to explain this behavior in terms of it. But I don't think we know that's true. It's not the case that there's some common currency of motivation, that we have some reason to think that everyone's motivated by the same thing all the way deep down. Hitler and Chopin were trying to achieve the same thing. They just had very different ways of going about doing it. And Hitler's was bad and Chopin's was okay and were great. But what they were trying to do is, achieve personal satisfaction or well-being or happiness. And they meant they're the very same thing by it. Just Hitler thought enslaving a nation and killing a race of people would do it. And Chopin thought, writing nocturnes would do it. And I don't think there's any reality to that view of human motivation. They had very different things they were after in life, and they formed very different views of what they wanted out of life. And there's no one thing, self-interest, they were both pursuing. Their interests were very different. There are some common things, but the common things, I think, are not at the levels of goals. They're at the levels of facts about human nature, human needs, and human abilities that set the context in which people form goals. And if you're talking about incentives and their role here, I think one can talk about it in terms of those things. There are situations in which people could get away with living as failures to launch and other situations in which they could get away with it less so. And maybe people with less affluent parents, who don't have a basement or whatever, become people taking up their parents' basements less often because they're more confronted with the realities of life and the needs to kind of put up or shut up. And they either grow up faster and do something to make a life for themselves, or they really flame out really badly. The failure to launch is a kind of person who's like, being prevented from hitting a rock bottom and also not rising. And so there are kinds of situations like that where if you're insulated from the consequences of your actions, it's maybe easier to avoid alternatives other people face, where you have to either rise to the occasion or sink below it. But so you can explain things in ways like that about incentive. But for every failure to launch, or I don't know, for every dozen, there's someone who really launches, right? And who has the same kind of, parents with a cushy basement that he could be staying in. And I don't think it's all explicable by them having different incentive structures, different environments, different backgrounds. Part of it is they're doing something different with their mind. And I think part of what we know about ourselves in every moment where we're thinking or making a decision is that it's not all set for us by our genes or our environment. There's something we're doing now in the moment that makes a causal difference. And if we know that about ourselves in the moment, then we infer it about everybody else in every other moment. And we know that we can't explain everything by just citing the incentive structures. A lot of it is the choices people are making. Which choices, then create incentives for others and factor in. So like there's a lot of place for this kind of economic analysis, but it can't be everything, I think.
You said that you thought Chopin and Hitler had very different things that they were going after. And I would go even a little further and say,
I don't know why I picked those two. I mean, I wanted someone good and someone bad.
Right. But
yeah.
it's more than just they had different goals. It's they had different overall motivational sets. Like one of them is motivated by creation of values that he loves. Another one is motivated by hatred and fear of things that he dislikes.
So I could have picked two good people, so to speak, who have very different motivations, but at a more abstract level, they're the same. So say it's, I don't know, Chopin and John D. Rockefeller or something. Like, different guys did different things. I think both of them are good, but they both, were ambitious and tried to create some things, but, maybe they wouldn't have even liked one another. They had different things that were motivating them, but they were all, I think, at the level of it can be summarized abstractly by what Rourke was doing with the bending the stick. I think they were motivated by their work, motivated by wanting to create something. It's just that motivation isn't saying they're motivated by wanting to create something, isn't giving some ultimate goal that's further down the line of this is for the sake of that and that's for the sake of this, than Chopin wanting to make music and Rockefeller wanting to create oil and create industry. It's rather a more abstract way of describing what is the ultimate value for each of them, a different life of creative work. But then when you get to someone who's essentially destructive, I think there's another difference, that the same abstraction doesn't even sum up what they want.
And
what they want is
speaks
different
to,
even at the abstract level.
It speaks to your point about how it depends on the choices they make with their mind, because nobody's born a hater. Even kids who have strange personalities, nobody's born that way. That's something that you develop over time because of choices that you make, because there are things you just don't want to see in your life, and you push them out of your mind, and then this becomes habitual, and you whenever you see the thing that you pushed out of your mind, you want to destroy it.
I mean, yeah, this is I think Rand's theory of the kind of theory of evil, and how it comes out of this view of free will. I gave a talk on this last year, I think, or 2 years ago, at the Objectivist conference called "The Nature of Evil." So for people who want my take on this, that's where it is. But yeah, I very much think that's right. Okay, we've talked about how our haters are going to hate, and maybe it's time to shake it off. And
Okay, Taylor.
Say goodbye to our. I'm reminded of a friend of ours who's no longer with us, but was at my house once, and for some reason Amazon was putting all of its boxes in like some kind of Taylor Swift wrapping. I guess to advertise some yeah, Amazon Prime. It was their advertisement or to advertise Amazon Music, and like so I had all these Taylor Swift boxes around, not through any interest in Taylor Swift, just I was ordering a lot from Amazon, and she was kind of making fun of me, and it's for that, and it's kind of amusing memory. Anyway, with that memory, and let's say goodbye to everyone. Next week we're not going to have an episode of this kind of chat-based podcast because there's going to be on Tuesday. We're going to try to do these on Tuesdays regularly, and next Tuesday there's going to be a talk by Tara Smith on freedom of the press in the age of misinformation. So it'll be at around this time, same bat channel, and that'll be on that. And then we'll be back with something like this kind of discussion format in 2 weeks. Not sure what the topic will be yet. Sometime, though, we should do the topic of thinking about elections and how to choose political candidates before.
But people
election
should
day.
come to Tara's talk
Yes.
and ask questions there, and maybe
Particularly
that'll give us
people-
ideas for topics.
Particularly people here in Austin come to Tara's Talk. We'll also be, I think, putting Tara's Talk up live on YouTube. If not, it'll be put on YouTube afterwards. And I'm not sure if we'll do questions from YouTube. But yeah, please come to that talk. It'll be really interesting. And that is part of Free Speech Week, which next week is.
All right.
So with that, wish you all a week of individuality and free